The sun beat down like a hammer on the blistered, faded paint of the Ford Ranger, its once proud shell now looking lean and weathered, like an old fence post. Inside, Elias Vance pressed his forehead to the steering wheel, the vinyl hot and smelling faintly of stale coffee and desperation. His stomach was a rumbling, hollow drum. Every cough and sputter from the engine felt like a personal betrayal, a final physical reminder that he was adrift. His life had narrowed down to the confines of this truck, the worn seat his bed, the dashboard his desk, and the glove compartment, now his bank. He had $52.34 to his name, and the fuel light had been on for 24 agonizing miles. Elias was a man who had once argued esoteric points of historical preservation in wood-paneled lecture halls. Now he was just the everyman on the edge, one bad engine sound away from total collapse. He had been looking for a place to break down with dignity, far from the cold, judging lights of the city that had chewed him up and spit him out. He found himself on the dusty shoulder of a forgotten stretch of highway where a hand-painted sign advertised a closing down sale. There was a certain gravity to the place, a sad, lonely air of things being given up. He pulled the truck over, its rear suspension sagging like an old man's shoulders under the weight of his few possessions. Elias didn't need a thing, but the sheer inertia of his day-to-day existence had been replaced by a crushing psychic need for something to happen. That's when he saw it. Tucked between a stack of moth-eaten blankets and a rusted wheelbarrow sat a safe. It was small, no larger than a thick briefcase, yet radiating a profound sense of heavy, silent importance. The black metal was dusty, the surface worn smooth in places, but what caught Elias's eye were the etchings, a strange stylized crest featuring an osprey and a sun, and beneath it a Latin phrase, both anachronistic and faintly familiar, carved into the cold steel. It looked like it had been salvaged from a shipwreck or a forgotten manor house. A crudely scrawled tag, flapping in the heat, read, "Heavy safe, needs key, $50. Elias felt a sharp, irrational tug. It was a stupid purchase. It was his last shot at a decent meal. It was the only way he knew left to seize control. He walked over, handed the proprietor a crumpled $50 bill, and with a grunt of effort hauled the iron box into the back of his failing truck. The safe's presence felt immediately physically heavy, a solid weight against the terrifying lightness of his empty future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Back in the dubious safety of his cab, Elias attacked the safe. He ran his fingers over the dial, searching for a hidden button, a mechanism that might give. There was no dial, only a keyhole, dark and simple. A key. Elias slumped back, exhausted, the heat pressing in on him. He had just spent his last hope on a piece of locked iron. It was precisely then, in the absolute trough of his misery, that his hand slid into the ripped seam of his passenger seat, a seam he had felt 1,000 times, and touched something cold and metallic. He pulled it out. It was a key. Not a normal key, but a single, thick piece of tarnished brass, the head oddly shaped, mirroring the crest on the safe. The same osprey. His breath caught in his throat. He had owned this truck for 6 years. He had never seen this key. With hands that shook not from hunger, but from a sudden dizzying sense of dramatic possibility, Elias fit the key into the lock. It turned once with a sickeningly smooth click. The latch gave. He pulled the heavy lid open. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed velvet, were only 2 objects. The first was a journal, thick, leather-bound, its pages aged to the color of bone, dated simply 1937 on the spine. The second was a single, heavy gold coin, tarnished nearly black, but unmistakably bearing the same strange osprey crest and Latin inscription as the safe itself. This wasn't some inheritance. This was a deliberate breadcrumb placed decades ago, waiting for a specific lost soul to find it. Elias lifted the journal. The leather cracked softly in the stifling heat. He opened it to the very first page. It wasn't a diary entry. It was an architectural sketch, a blueprint meticulously drawn in ink, detailing a hidden, impossible structure, a subterranean vault, its walls impossibly thick, bearing the same unique seal. A secret, a lie, a massive, staggering what if. As he stared at the sketch, the osprey crest burning itself into his vision, a sound cut through the oppressive silence of the country road. A low, powerful engine, smooth and almost silent. He looked up. Driving slowly, almost insolently past his truck, was a clean, black, late-model sedan. It was violently out of place in this landscape of dust and decay. It was polished, armored, and its windows were deeply tinted, obscuring the occupants completely. The car did not speed. It simply coasted to a crawl directly beside his truck, paused for 3 long, silent seconds, just long enough for anyone inside to register the image of the beat-up Ford, the open safe, and the hollow-eyed man holding a 100-year-old journal. Then, without a flash of brake light or a sudden acceleration, it moved on, disappearing down the road. It wasn't a warning, it was a confirmation. The silent institutional power that had destroyed his career was now aware that he had just bought his way into their secret, and they were watching. His destiny was changed, but the change had just made him a target. The journal lay on the worn seat beside Elias, a physical block of history that felt impossibly hot, the strange gold coin nestled in its curve. He didn't need to open the leather again to know what it meant. The osprey crest had already burned a path back through the years, igniting the dying embers of the man he used to be. The man who had worn a tweed jacket instead of a dirty T-shirt, who had breathed the air of mahogany libraries instead of exhaust fumes and despair. Elias Vance hadn't been born an outcast. He had been a seeker, a promising young light in the stale, hallowed halls of historical preservation. His focus wasn't on the grand, obvious monuments. It was on the gaps, the redactions, the structural secrets buried beneath the veneer of accepted history. His true, latent skill was not merely reading blueprints, but feeling them, seeing the ghost of the architect's intent, detecting the minute structural anomaly, the slight deviation in a stress calculation that suggested a false wall or a forgotten chamber. He could look at a building and see the lie it was telling. It was this obsession with the suppressed truth that led him to the Aethelred Circle. Officially, they were a myth, a whisper in the footnotes of early American history, a secretive, reclusive society of financiers and thinkers who reputedly fled the cultural centers in the 1930s, convinced that a coming global war would destroy the cultural legacy of the West. Elias wasn't interested in the mythology. He was interested in the paper trail, the near-invisible transactions that suggested the circle hadn't just vanished. They had built something. They had created a hidden treasury, not of gold, but of irreplaceable documents, the cultural memory of an age, sealed off and preserved until the world stabilized. This pursuit became his flaw, an obsessive, manic dedication that consumed him whole. He couldn't let it go, because his research showed it wasn't a myth. It was a certainty. The antithesis of his pursuit, the institutional force arrayed against him, was the Wakefield Foundation. They weren't a university. They were something far older and more entrenched, a powerful old-money private research firm with fingers deep in every major historical society, every endowment, every academic funding source in the country. The Wakefield Foundation was history's gatekeeper. When Elias first published his early findings, suggesting the Aethelred treasury was real, the Foundation moved with cold, surgical precision. Their scholars, impeccably dressed and impeccably credentialed, publicly refuted Elias's work as fringe paranoia and historical sensationalism. They used their institutional power to not just discredit him, but to vaporize his career. His funding was cut. His key faculty sponsor was subtly, professionally encouraged to retire. Elias was exiled. But his exile was born of discovery, not madness. His last academic paper, the one that triggered the final lethal strike from the Foundation, focused on a series of anomalous land purchases made by the Foundation itself during the late 1930s, precisely the window of the Aethelred Circle's reputed disappearance. These purchases were complex, multi-layered land deals in geographically remote mountain regions, properties that seemed wholly unremarkable but shared one common, peculiar characteristic. They encompassed specific, recorded geological features that Elias's research had flagged as potential deep storage sites. He had included a copy of one 1937 deed in the paper detailing the purchase of an immense, secluded tract of land in Appalachia by a shell corporation with immediate, irrefutable ties to the Foundation's founder. The Foundation hadn't just denied the Treasury's existence, they had actively purchased the land where it was likely hidden. The Foundation's power ensured his ruin was thorough, professional, and absolute. They didn't just fire him, they ensured he could never teach, never publish, and never get funding again. They sealed his file, creating a vacuum where a brilliant career should have been. The irony was a heavy, bitter taste. They had branded him a liar for finding the truth they themselves were concealing. Now, with the safe's weight on the seat, with the journal's leather binding warm beneath his fingertips, and with the shadow of a black sedan still receding in his rearview mirror, the connection was no longer theoretical. The tarnished osprey crest, the 1937 date, and the undeniable architectural sketch. It all converged. The Aethelred Circle was real. The Hidden Treasury was real. And the Wakefield Foundation was not its protector, but its warden, the antagonist that had spent decades silencing the truth and anyone, like Elias, who came too close to finding it. He had spent his last $50, not on a relic, but on the key to his own vindication, the opening shot in a war he thought he'd already lost. His desperate, irrational purchase had just launched his redemption. Elias drove until the polished black sedan was nothing but a cold knot of dread shrinking in his rearview mirror. He needed isolation, a pocket of silence far from prying eyes and the rumble of the highway. He found it down a logging road, a place where the trees grew too close and the air hung heavy with the smell of pine needle decay, the kind of darkness that only existed far from city lights. He parked the Ranger deep in the brush and killed the engine. The only sound was the clicking of the cooling metal. He finally opened the journal properly. The leather was brittle, the scent of aged paper and dry glue thick and historical. The book belonged to Arthur Hayes, a name Elias knew immediately. Hayes was a brilliant but tragically disgraced structural architect of the 1930s who vanished from the historical record after a spectacular professional collapse. The official story was consumption and failure. Elias, the former researcher, knew that failure was often the code word for inconvenient truth. Hayes had been involved in projects that were too ambitious, too secret, too dangerous. The handwriting inside was elegant but rushed, the ink often smudged, the hand of a man working quickly and under extreme pressure. The narrative voice was sparse, direct, and filled with a tension that leaped across the decades. These weren't flowery, reflective diary entries. They were functional, breathless accounts of a terrifying, all-consuming professional commitment. Hayes confirmed everything Elias had staked his career on. He had been hired by the Aethelred Circle to design and build their vault, a colossal subterranean structure hidden deep in the American wilderness. Hayes didn't call it a vault for gold. He repeatedly referred to it as the repository of conscience, a monumental safe designed to hold an unimaginable cache of irreplaceable historical documents, treaties, cultural artifacts, and films all rescued from the impending chaos of a world marching toward war. Not wealth of coin, an early entry read, but wealth of record, the truth we hold until the world can bear it again. Hayes spoke of the structural challenges with pride, a concrete mix designed to withstand a direct bombing run, air filtration systems engineered for 100 years of dormancy. This was a man at the height of his craft, working on the most important commission of his life. But the tone soured quickly. The early exhilaration gave way to paranoia. Hayes wrote about the constant sense of being watched, about armed men with no identifying marks guarding the site, and about the growing, malignant influence of a small, powerful group within the circle he called the Committee. This was the first clue, the first twist of the knife that foreshadowed the eventual betrayal. The Committee now dictates the specification, Hayes scrawled on one page, the ink dug deep into the paper. They demand a structural redundancy, a level of ceiling that is excessive, impossible. They want this to be a vault for more than just paper. They want it to be a tomb for silence. They want the contents to be irretrievable. Elias stopped breathing. This committee, he instantly realized, was the Proto-Wakefield Foundation, the powerful men who had co-opted the Aethelred Circle's noble mission for their own insidious purposes. They weren't protecting history, they were burying a version of it that contradicted their own rise to power. Then an extraordinary detail. On a heavily annotated page detailing the precise structural measurements for the vault's massive circular steel door, Hayes had drawn a small, quick sketch in the margin. It was a coin, a crude but unmistakable drawing of the gold coin Elias held in his hand, bearing the osprey crest. The inscription below the drawing was chilling. The price of silence, paid in gold for 100 years of shame. The journal's final, most critical entries were vague, almost poetic, a deliberate obfuscation designed to foil casual discovery. Hayes knew he was compromised, and he encrypted the location. He wrote of the site using metaphorical language, where the stone teeth chew the sky, clearly referencing a specific dramatic natural landmark, a unique, jagged ridge in the Appalachian Mountains. More crucially, he provided a sequence of numbers, scrawled beneath a sketch of a surveyor's mark, 481.066.9. It wasn't GPS. It wasn't a combination. It was a cryptic numerical sequence that to a modern man would mean nothing. But to Elias, the disgraced architectural researcher who had memorized decades of regional land surveys, it was the specific, unique survey marker number for a 1930s land parcel. He now had the truth, the betrayal, the architect's warning, and a coded map. The hidden treasury was real, and it was the foundational lie of the Wakefield Foundation. As the sun began to dip below the ridgeline, casting long, desperate shadows across the truck cab, Elias tucked the journal away. The darkness was closing in, but he was no longer lost. He had a focus, a direction, and a terrifying sense of urgency. The men in the black sedan hadn't just followed him. They had followed the gold coin, and they knew he was carrying the key to their deepest secret. The silence of the pine forest was broken only by the frantic scratching of Elias's pencil against a notepad. He had spread the precious documents out on the hood of his truck, weighting down the corners of the brittle 1937-dated architectural sketch with stones. This drawing, the key laid bare on the journal's first page, was not a generalized concept. It was a specific, meticulously detailed blueprint for a section of a larger structure. His latent skill, the instinct that had ruined his career but was now his salvation, snapped back online, analyzing the lines of force and mass. The sketch showed a complex system of load-bearing walls and false chambers, a brilliant, cynical piece of structural deception. Hayes hadn't just built a vault. He had engineered a structural anomaly, a hidden wing designed to appear on all legitimate records as a blank section of solid foundation or an unremarkable service area. The drawing detailed a clever interplay of internal and external bracing where a simple concrete wall should have been, creating a buffer zone an optical illusion for surveyors and engineers. It was evidence of a secret space that was never meant to be found. The scope of the conspiracy, the sheer audacious scale of the effort to bury this thing, was breathtaking. He had the what, but he needed the where. He needed to connect Hayes's poetic, frantic clues to the cold, hard data that had once filled his academic life. He pulled out the notepad where he had quickly transcribed the vague, encrypted location notes from the journal, "Where the stone teeth chew the sky," and the cryptic numerical sequence, 481 0669. He didn't need the internet or a massive database. Elias, the man who had lost everything chasing this ghost, had the crucial piece of information locked in his own mind. He had spent years immersed in the dusty pre-digital land records of the Appalachian region. He knew that the numerical sequence was not a random number. It was a specific old-style survey marker number from a 1930s federal land grant survey, uniquely tied to a specific parcel of land in western Virginia. With a sudden, powerful surge of adrenaline, he cross-referenced this survey number with the other piece of the puzzle, the Wakefield Foundation's suspicious land acquisition. He pulled out the single sheet of paper he had salvaged from his ruined office, a copy of the deed he had tried and failed to publish. The deed for the purchase of the Old Stone Lodge by a Wakefield subsidiary in 1938. The geographic coordinates on that very deed lined up perfectly with the survey marker number and the natural landmark. The realization was not a gentle dawning, it was a blinding flash of vindication. The location was a secluded, derelict property, a former hunting lodge in a remote valley, high in the mountains of Appalachia, legally owned, still, by a paper-thin subsidiary of the Wakefield Foundation. The foundation hadn't just fought his theory, they had physically acquired the historical lie and built a century of institutional authority on top of its concrete roof. Elias had been right all along. The treasury wasn't a myth. It was a structure, and he knew exactly where it was. He packed his papers quickly, the meticulous drawings of Arthur Hayes and the cold records of Preston Wakefield merging into a single path forward. The next step was the long drive, the final confrontation with the place that held the truth. He started the truck. It coughed, spat a gout of oily smoke, and shuddered back to life, fueled by the sheer necessity of the moment. He needed to move, and he needed to move now, while the silence of the country road still offered a fragile shield. But the silence was shattered. The threat materialized, not in the form of a black sedan, but from above. A high-pitched, insistent whine sliced through the pine needles. Elias threw himself out of the truck and looked up. Hovering over the small clearing, barely visible against the canopy, was a device of cold, modern efficiency, a small black drone. It was not a toy. It was equipped with a high-powered lens and a visible array of sensors. It hung there for a full minute, an eternity, its electronic eye locked onto his position, examining the battered truck, the scattered papers, and the man who should have been broken. Then, with a sudden, silent banking maneuver, it moved away, accelerating rapidly out of the canyon of trees. The Foundation wasn't just aware of him, they were actively, technologically watching. They knew he had the safe, the key, and the location. Elias was no longer an exiled academic chasing ghosts. He was an existential threat to one of the most powerful institutions in the country, and he knew they were preparing to move not to stop his research, but to erase the evidence he was about to uncover. His clock had just started ticking. The road became his singular focus, a narrowing tunnel of cracked asphalt that pulled him deep into the oppressive heart of the Appalachian wilderness. Elias scraped together his last scraps of cash, enough for gas only, the fumes themselves smelling like the last vestiges of his old life. The journey was a physical ordeal, a grinding testimony to his desperation. The Ranger's engine protested every incline, each labored rumble of the failing engine a desperate plea for rest. The mountain landscape closed in around him, a succession of steep, shadowed folds of earth where the canopy was so thick the midday sun became a faint, watery suggestion. This was the country of the Aethelred Circle, a region of isolation and silence, a place where secrets could be buried for 100 years without ever smelling the city air. The growing sense of isolation was palpable. Every mile marker he passed felt like another anchor he was cutting to the world he knew. He was chasing a ghost, an exiled academic in a broken truck, heading toward a battle against an opponent that possessed limitless resources and no conscience. He drove until the name on the old deed matched the geological reality unfolding before him. He found the old stone lodge. It stood on a rise above a slow, murky creek, massive and forbidding, clearly once a place of serious, exclusive power. It was grand in scale, but utterly, profoundly decaying. The roof lines sagged like an old man's shoulders, the windows were dark, hollow eyes, and the stone facade was stained by decades of rain and neglect. It looked less like a derelict property and more like a mausoleum for a historical ambition that had failed. The entrance was impossible. A massive wrought-iron gate was rusted shut, secured with a chain that looked as thick as a man's arm. Weather-beaten signs were posted every 50 feet. Private property. No trespassing. Video monitored. The entire perimeter was a testament to ownership and exclusion. Elias pulled off the road and parked in a deep thicket of rhododendrons, where his truck, covered in road dust and despair, was swallowed by the shadows. He could feel the eyes of the black sedan, even though it was gone. He could feel the eye of the drone. He was standing on the threshold of the Wakefield Foundation's deepest secret. He spent the next hour on foot, circling the sprawling structure, using Hayes's original blueprint as his guide. The lodge was built on a series of uneven terraces, seemingly natural. But Elias's latent skill allowed him to see past the foliage and the facade. His research told him that structures built into bedrock like this often required unmarked service tunnels for drainage and utility access, designed to be hidden from casual view. He found the structural anomaly exactly where the blueprint suggested. On the northeastern face of the foundation, where the plans showed a solid, uninterrupted section of foundation wall, a thick curtain of tangled ivy and ancient rhododendron masked a recessed cutout. He pulled back the heavy vines, his hands tearing on the thorns. Beneath them, tucked into the dark crevice, was a small, square stone slab, a disguised utility access point that should have been marked on any legitimate public plan. It was the entrance to a long-forgotten service tunnel. He pressed his ear to the stone, tapping gently with the handle of his small wrench. The sound was instantly wrong, a hollow drum beat where there should have been the solid, dead sound of concrete poured against bedrock. A false wall. Hayes had designed this access point, knowing that one day it would be necessary to breach the site without using the official, highly secured main entrances. There was no time for finesse. The tension was a coiled spring in his chest. It's now or never. His actions became sparse and functional, driven purely by the need to progress. He wedged his chisel into the seam of the stone slab. Using the wrench for leverage, he exerted every pound of force he had left. The stone, sealed for over 80 years, resisted violently, then gave way with a low, grinding sound of displaced earth and rusted metal. A gap opened, wide enough to slide through. The air that rushed out was cold, thick, and smelled of damp earth and old coal, the unmistakable rich smell of hidden history. Elias didn't hesitate. He slid through the narrow opening, pulling the loose stone back into place behind him. He was now plunged into suffocating darkness and absolute silence, the only sound his own ragged breathing. He activated the small, weak light on his phone. He was standing in a narrow, wet service shaft, the air thick and heavy. He was physically inside the antagonist's territory, completely cut off, utterly alone, and one step closer to the truth. The long night of history had finally begun to yield its secrets. The narrow service passage was a damp, suffocating throat of stone, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and old coal. It was an oppressive, claustrophobic tunnel dug not by machines, but by men with shovels and secrets. Elias moved through it, bent double, his phone light carving a weak, trembling cone through the absolute darkness. Every step was a careful scrape of his worn boots against the slick, uneven floor. He was walking through a century of silence, and the silence felt heavy, active, and hostile. After what felt like an eternity of tense, forward motion, the tunnel abruptly opened into a space slightly wider, where the air grew marginally drier. The light revealed a small, square room, an architectural afterthought dug directly into the bedrock, perfectly concealed from the main lodge foundation. This was the place where Arthur Hayes had once worked, the secret workshop of a brilliant man on the precipice of ruin. Dust lay thick over everything, an undisturbed blanket of 80 years. Elias's light played over a crude, stone-slab desk, a chipped stool, and in the corner a dusty, forgotten toolkit, hammers, chisels, and strange, precision-measuring devices from a bygone era. This was the material proof of Hayes's presence, but the true evidence lay beneath the desk. Kneeling down, Elias pulled free a canister of thick rolled paper. It was a second, much larger architectural roll, bound with brittle twine. He unrolled it carefully on the desk, weighing down the curling edges with the old tools. The phone light wasn't enough, but the sheer agonizing detail of the drawing was immediately apparent. This wasn't a sketch. This was the complete, original blueprints for the lodge, including the secret treasury itself. The plans were terrifyingly complex, a nightmare of engineering designed for absolute, permanent concealment. They showed the treasury was a massive subterranean bunker, a cylinder of reinforced concrete sunk hundreds of feet into the mountain, a fortress designed to withstand anything short of a cataclysm. The crucial detail, the one that made Elias's stomach clench, was the complete lack of any access point on the main schematic. It was completely sealed off, a structure designed to receive its contents, then be buried forever. It was not a storage unit, it was a time capsule of silence. He turned back to the original journal, flipping through the later entries now that he had the full context of the structure. The entries became jagged, increasingly erratic. Hayes's initial pride had curdled into horror. The journal's warning was stark and immediate. Hayes realized the truth too late. The committee, the future leadership of the Wakefield Foundation, never intended to use the treasury for noble historical preservation. They had co-opted the Aethelred Circle's mission. They demanded the vaults be sealed immediately after the final deposit, Hayes wrote, the handwriting a furious scrawl. It is not documentation they seek to save, but evidence of their own crime, the records of their manipulation, their betrayal of the Circle's ideals, the original accounting that will invalidate their entire institutional authority. The truth, locked away, would have revealed the Wakefield Foundation's roots in greed and corruption, reducing their prestigious history to a century-long, elaborate lie. Hayes, horrified, wrote of his frantic, desperate attempts to sabotage the sealing process, to design a flaw, a small, hidden backdoor into the sealed system. I tried to build a second way, a small conduit to the surface, a message of hope in the concrete. I failed. They found the anomaly. Elias read the lament of a man who realized he had been an accomplice to history's greatest robbery. Hayes had failed to build the obvious escape route, but as Elias re-rolled the large blueprint, his fingers brushed against a piece of thin, heavy vellum tucked deep inside the architectural tube. He pulled it out. It was a small, hand-drawn map, not of the lodge, but of the surrounding geological features. It was rough, yet precise, referencing the same stone teeth landmark. This wasn't the failed conduit Hayes wrote about in the journal. This was his actual successful secret, a weakness in the structure that Hayes designed only he would know. It wasn't a door or a window, it was a vulnerability. The map detailed a specific fault line in the bedrock near the lodge, and how the Treasury's foundation abutted it, a single calculable point of structural failure that, if hit precisely, would allow access. It was an intellectual signature, the architect's final silent scream of defiance against the committee. Elias held the map, the cold, hard weight of the knowledge settling in his chest. He now had the full story: the crime, the criminal, the tomb, and the secret key to the lock. The stakes had just escalated from personal vindication to a race against the institutional power that had destroyed his life. A race he knew he would soon be running not just against time, but against the very men who were sworn to protect their lie. The chill scent of pine and damp earth was cut by the clean metallic taste of fear. Elias Vance was back at the old stone lodge, moving through the thickening gloom like a ghost. The black sedan still sat down the road, a patient, lethal sentinel, but he couldn't wait for darkness to give him cover. The warning etched on his windshield demanded immediate action. He risked a direct encounter because he had no other option. The truth, buried beneath tons of rock and concrete, was more valuable than his life. He pulled out the hand-drawn map, Hayes's final desperate attempt at defiance. This was the true key. It wasn't drawn for a burglar, it was a riddle written in the arcane, elegant language of 1930s engineering and geology. A language that had cost Elias everything, but was now his most powerful weapon. The drawing showed contour lines, geological strata, and stress calculations for the bedrock, overlaid with the schematic of the Treasury's foundation. Elias, the obsessed research academic, spread the map against the rough stone of the lodge's crumbling foundation, his phone light illuminating the dense cross-hatching and cryptic annotations. The map wasn't pointing to a hidden door, which Hayes had failed to build. It was pointing to a principle. The back door was a genius stroke of structural weakness. Hayes had exploited a natural fault line running beneath the lodge, a seismic weakness in the mountain that had to be stabilized to sink the bunker. The map showed that the massive cylindrical treasury was not monolithic. It was a concrete shell built against this fault line, relying on a specific triangular section of naturally occurring, unstable rock for support. If that triangular support was compromised, the internal structural pressures of the massive concrete cylinder would theoretically create a fracture, a calculable, tiny fissure, that would grant access without triggering a full collapse. The pinpointed location was a specific rock formation about 50 yards from the main structure, half hidden by a thick outcrop of mountain laurel. It didn't look like an entry point. It looked like just another feature of the endless ancient mountain. But Hayes's calculations were precise, down to the millimeter. This wasn't brute force, it was surgical physics. As Elias traced the fracture point with a trembling finger, the immense gravity of the stakes crashed down on him. This was not just about his personal vindication, about proving the Wakefield Foundation lied. The journal, the ledgers, the documents locked beneath him were the records of a century of institutional corruption, the truth that would dismantle a fraudulent legacy. The danger was not merely the foundation finding him and silencing him, it was the chilling professional realization that they would destroy the evidence. They will demolish the lie if they think it is exposed, he whispered to the silence of the trees. The sheer size of the treasury meant it could be destroyed in only one way. Massive, calculated implosion, sealing the contents forever beneath a mountain of rubble. The stakes had been raised violently and permanently. He was no longer an underdog seeking redemption. He was the desperate, final guardian of an essential part of hidden history. He packed the map, secured the journal, and tightened the straps of his worn bag containing the hammer and chisel. his absurdly meager weapons against a massive institutional lie. He stood for one final moment, taking a deep, ragged breath, preparing to make his first physical move toward the breach point. It was then he heard it. The air, which had been silent and dead, began to transmit a low, persistent frequency. It was a deep, guttural sound traveling up the valley, not the smooth purr of a sedan's engine, but the unmistakable, heavy rumble of heavy machinery. It was mechanical, powerful, and deliberate. It wasn't a patrol. It was a deployment. They weren't waiting for him to leave. They were coming to secure the site, and the quickest way to secure a century-old secret is to bury it permanently. They weren't waiting. They were coming to demolish. Elias didn't need to see the lights or hear the commands. The sound alone, traveling through the cold mountain air, was the alarm bell of his rapidly approaching end. His window had just slammed shut. He turned, abandoning the cover of the lodge's decay, and raced toward the hidden rock formation, the only chance he had to outrun the demolition. The heavy, mechanical growl was now closer, bouncing off the mountain slopes and turning the still air into a field of auditory threat. Elias had to move fast. He began the hike, scrambling over loose shale and tangled roots, pushing toward the rock formation marked on Hayes's final, desperate map. Every nerve ending was screaming, but his mind, fueled by the idea's imminent danger, was coldly focused on the structural calculations. The oppressive mountain air was hot and thick, and the effort of the climb, coupled with days of near starvation, turned his lungs into burning bellows. The sound of his own heavy breathing was amplified in the isolation, a ragged, frantic rhythm accompanying the distant, menacing thrum of the approaching machinery. This was a direct physical conflict, the tired, starved body of the truth-seeker versus the brutal efficiency of institutional cover-up. The stakes demanded a frantic need for speed that his body struggled to meet. He found the obstacle precisely where the map dictated. It was an outcrop of dark, striated rock, massive and seemingly impenetrable. This was the vulnerability, the point where the Treasury's foundation pressed against the mountain's natural structure. To any untrained eye, it was just a naturally occurring rock slide, a random cascade of stone. But Hayes, the master architect, had designed this natural chaos to conceal his purpose. It had been cleverly disguised by decades of natural collapse and foundation landscaping, creating a perfectly innocent-looking barrier. Elias pulled out his few basic tools, the small hammer, the chisel, and the worn length of rope, relics of a different kind of life, now pressed into service as tools of historical rebellion. He ignored the instinct to strike randomly and instead used his fingers to trace the seams, searching for the exact keystone Hayes had marked in his final diagram, the stone whose removal would shift the internal pressure and induce the required structural fissure. He found it, a wedge-shaped piece of granite set in an unnatural position. As he drove the chisel into the seam and prepared his first forceful strike, the night was brutally broken. A powerful beam of light swept the area, cutting through the trees like a knife. It was huge, industrial, and devastatingly bright. The heavy machinery has arrived. Down the slope, beyond the perimeter, he could see the silhouette of a massive drilling rig and, closer still, the bobbing lights of men moving through the darkness. The Foundation's security detail is now actively sweeping the perimeter. They were close enough for him to hear the faint crackle of their radios. He has mere minutes before they reach his location. He didn't panic. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. The anxiety was sublimated into focus. He raised the hammer and drove the chisel deep into the granite wedge. He struck it hard, not with random violence, but with the calculated, precise knowledge of structural physics that was his only advantage. The chisel rang against the rock, the sound terrifyingly loud in the tense silence. He drove it deeper, relying on the knowledge that the pressure was all internal, waiting for the rock's resistance to give way to the engineered weakness. One strike. The stone didn't move. 2 strikes. The ground beneath him trembled slightly, responding to the machinery now digging into the dirt nearby. 3 strikes. A low, deep grinding sound emanated from the rock face, not a crash, but a sickening internal shift. The granite wedge gave way. It slid free, and the stones immediately surrounding it settled with a loud, percussive thump. The structural vulnerability had been triggered. Elias shoved the chisel aside. Where the rock face had been solid, there was now a ragged, uneven hole, a passage into the earth, ringed by unstable stone. It revealed a dark, narrow shaft, choked with dust and the smell of ancient, stagnant air. It was tight, dangerous, and perfectly aligned with Hayes's forgotten plans. The breakthrough was complete. He had found the secret entry to the treasury. He glanced back one final time. The searchlights were closer. He threw the rope into the shaft, grabbed his bag of documents, and plunged into the hole, pulling the disturbed rocks back over the opening as best he could, leaving the oppressive noise of the encroaching world above him. The rope was thin and biting, scraping against the rough-hewn sides of the fissure. Elias's descent was tight, dangerous, and utterly silent save for the rasp of the worn hemp and the echo of his own frantic heart. He was slipping, falling into the very mouth of the conspiracy, the last vestiges of the sunlight extinguished above him by the stones he had dislodged. The air grew immediately colder, thicker, carrying with it a profound scent of aged paper and dry concrete, the heavy, undeniable smell of descending into the past. The mountain had swallowed him whole. He dropped the final 10 feet, landing hard on a thick, dusty floor. He lay still for a moment, letting the darkness absorb the pain. When his phone light finally cut through the gloom, the air was shimmering with fine, ancient dust. He was no longer in a tunnel. He was in a vast, cold cavern of human design. Elias stood up slowly, the light sweeping around him. The main chamber was a colossal, overwhelming space, the rumored Aethelred Treasury. It was perfectly circular, built of smooth, seamless, reinforced concrete, a masterpiece of 1930s engineering designed to last 1,000 years. It looked like the core of the earth, quiet and immutable. The scale was terrifying. From floor to ceiling, walls of cold, dark steel shelving ascended into the gloom, marching around the circumference like silent, enormous sentinels. Elias walked toward the nearest shelf, his boots scuffing a path through the dust of decades. He had always imagined this place, if it existed, would be filled with the glittering, obvious wealth that obsesses the amateur. But Arthur Hayes had been right. The treasury was no vault of gold or jewels. The contents were immeasurably more valuable. The shelves were packed, filled to capacity with hundreds upon hundreds of objects that represented the true wealth of the Aethelred Circle. Leather-bound ledgers, thick and formidable. Sealed metal film, canisters bearing cryptic labels, stacks of faded photographs documenting strange meetings in forgotten locales, and dozens of boxes brimming with brittle, handwritten correspondence. This was the physical archive of the Circle's inner workings, their true intentions, and their downfall. This was the buried conscience of an era, and it was the undeniable, physical truth of the Wakefield Foundation. Elias ran his hands over the spines of the ledgers. Personal correspondence of Senator X. Minutes of the 1938 banking consultation. Original charter of the American Cultural Preservation Trust. The history that Elias had been denied access to, the very records that had been publicly declared lost or destroyed, were here, sealed in concrete, kept silent by the very men who claimed to honor history. His eyes fell on one immense ledger, bound in black leather and far thicker than the rest. It sat conspicuously on a central lower shelf. With trembling hands, Elias pulled it free, the weight of it staggering. He placed it on the floor, and with a terrible sense of destiny fulfilled, he opened the cover. The revelation was immediate, brutal, and utterly vindicating. Scrolled across the heavy yellowed first page in stark formal lettering was the title, Wakefield Foundation Investment and Influence Log, 1935-1941. This was the smoking gun, the primary text of the betrayal. He flipped through the initial pages. They detailed the systemic manipulation of the historical record, the precise dates and amounts of money used in the bribing of government officials and university regents to ensure the land acquisitions and the subsequent silence. The ledger meticulously recorded the deliberate suppression of historical truths, specific testimonies and financial documents that would have exposed Preston Wakefield and his cohorts as war profiteers and corporate criminals who had enriched themselves by exploiting the very global crisis the Aethelred Circle sought to escape. Elias sank back onto his heels, the cold concrete seeping into his bones. The sheer audacious scope of the deception was breathtaking. The gold was the truth about who built the modern world and on what foundation of lies. It had been locked away by those who feared it, sealed by the ancestor of the institution that had ruthlessly destroyed Elias Vance's life. He had been chasing the shadow of this ledger for years, and now he held it. But the silence that had protected the secret for 80 years was about to be broken. A deep, resonant clang echoed through the massive chamber, the sound of heavy steel meeting concrete. It was coming from the direction of the sealed main entrance, hundreds of feet away. They had found the lodge's primary entrance and were now actively, violently breaching the outer barrier. Elias was inside the secret, but he was also trapped inside a tomb, and the Foundation was coming to reclaim their lie. The heavy clang that echoed through the colossal concrete chamber was the sound of the world's institutional power finally catching up to Elias Vance. His moment of vindication, the dizzying realization that he held the truth that would rewrite history, was violently cut short. The sound was quickly followed by the shriek of grinding metal and then a sickening thump as the final barrier of the sealed entrance gave way. The main Foundation security team had found the original intended way in, and now they were inside the outer ring of the treasury. Elias spun around, the large ledger clutched to his chest. He extinguished his phone light, plunging the vast chamber back into the dense, historical darkness. But it was too late. From the distant breach point, a massive, powerful tactical beam of light, brutally white, sliced across the cavernous space. The beam didn't search. It locked on, moving with chilling, practiced efficiency, finding Elias in less than 3 seconds. In the blinding pillar of light, the antagonist appeared. He was a man of cold, hard efficiency, dressed in a black tactical suit that looked violently opposed to the antique dignity of the vault. He was clean-cut, powerfully built, and carried a small, sophisticated satellite phone and a non-lethal deterrent weapon. He wasn't a historical preservationist. He was an enforcer. This was the head of Wakefield Security, a man without a name in the historical record, but with lethal authority in the present. The man stepped into the main chamber, his heavy, measured footsteps echoing on the smooth concrete floor. The sound was not frantic. It was patient, professional, and terrifyingly certain. He held up a hand, silencing the men, other dark shadows, who followed him. His voice, amplified slightly, was cold and functional, devoid of passion or threat, a flat delivery of institutional policy. "Mr. Vance," the antagonist stated, his voice ringing slightly, "put the journal down. We've come to finish your research." There was no negotiation, no question of his guilt or innocence. Elias knew, with crystalline clarity, that the Foundation didn't want the evidence back. They wanted the threat of the evidence permanently silenced and the man who found it removed from the equation. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the security team advanced and overwhelmed him. He couldn't fight them. His hammer and chisel were useless against this organized, professional violence. He was forced to remember the final desperate annotations in Hayes's journal, the words of a disgraced man trying to leave one last measure of defiance. The escape plan was born of pure structural physics, not combat. Hayes, in his final design notes, had detailed a hidden external pressure release valve for the air conditioning system, intended as a last-ditch maintenance feature. If that valve was abruptly opened, the pressure differential in the vast sealed bunker would not cause an explosion, but would instead vent a century of dry, particulate-laden air up the main shaft, creating a massive updraft of dust, a temporary blackout that would choke the chamber and blind the intruders. Elias dropped the large ledger just long enough to race along the wall, driven by pure instinct to the small metal plate Hayes had marked on the blueprint. He didn't have time to second-guess the structural calculations. He found the small recessed lever, cold and stiff, and slammed it forward with the heel of his hand. The effect was instantaneous and chaotic. With a massive sucking whoosh, the engineered air system vented. The main chamber was plunged into a swirling, blinding storm of fine, dry particulates, a dust-choked darkness that made the tactical light beam useless. The security officer's calm, authoritative voice broke into a gasp and a cough. This was his chance. The fight for the proof was not fought with fists, but with speed and the brutal economy of choice. He knew he couldn't grab everything. He couldn't take the entire archive. He had to prioritize the artifacts that told the indisputable story. Moving through the blinding, suffocating chaos, Elias grabbed the large Wakefield Foundation investment and influence log that lay open on the floor. He retrieved the original, small mystery safe he'd carried in, the Journal of Arthur Hayes, and, seeing their immediate power, snatched a handful of photographs that had fallen from a shelf nearby, the images of Preston Wakefield shaking hands with known wartime profiteers. The original $50 purchase, the key to the entire lie, was the crucial anchor. With the heavy bag of vindication slung across his shoulder, he didn't run toward the main breach. That was a death trap. He raced back toward the dark, small hole of his own making, the narrow, perilous fissure. He reached the bottom of the rope, put his foot on the slick first step, and began the desperate upward climb. Below him, the choking coughs of the Foundation's security team were turning into angry, muffled shouts. He was out of sight, but the sound was his constant companion. He climbed, hauling the heavy, history-laden bag up the narrow shaft, scrambling back toward the light and the impossible hope of escape. The climb out of the fissure was a brutal, desperate affair, a frantic clawing for daylight with the heavy weight of the world's truth strapped to his back. Elias emerged from the shaft into the cold mountain air just as the first harsh, white beams of light from the Foundation's security detail broke through the rhododendron thicket outside the lodge. He could hear the guttural shouts, the sound of men scrambling in the dust and shouting into radio microphones, the noise of institutional panic. He was visible, exposed, but he had the proof. He didn't hesitate. He slid down the mountainside, using the steep, loose shale to gain speed, battered and bruised, but no longer the man who had been defeated. The exhaustion was overwhelming, but the adrenaline of vindication was a bitter, powerful stimulant. The bag containing the ledger, the journal, and the small safe bounced against his hip, its weight not a burden, but a physical anchor to the truth. He reached his old, beat-up truck, his last sanctuary, and threw the bag onto the passenger seat. The engine caught on the first desperate turn of the key, spitting out a plume of grateful smoke. He wrenched the truck around, slammed the accelerator to the floor, and drove away, leaving the furious, muffled sound of shouting behind him, the black sedan and the lodge receding in his rearview mirror like a terrible, defeated shadow. The sequence jumps forward. The setting is no longer the claustrophobic darkness of the mountain, but the calm, clinical light of a modern archive. The air is filtered, cool, and smells of paper and preservation. Elias, no longer a homeless drifter, stands tall, his clothes clean, his face bearing the marks of exhaustion and the quiet determination of a man whose life has been restored. He is surrounded by men and women in white gloves and scholarly attire. He had not gone to the police, knowing the Foundation's reach. He had gone to the Mendenhall Institute for Independent Historical Research, a respected organization that had suffered its own decades of quiet suppression and budget cuts orchestrated by the very same foundation. He had turned over the core evidence, the Wakefield Foundation investment and influence log, the original architectural drawings of Arthur Hayes, and the small, heavy safe, now a relic of the beginning. The documents were real, their provenance undeniable. The revelation was now a historical certainty. The detailed, meticulous entries in the ledger and the supporting documents proved the Wakefield Foundation was founded on a century-long, elaborate historical fraud. The truth they had sealed away was the record of their founders' crimes, and the whole venerable institution was nothing more than an 80-year-old alibi. The news, suppressed for the moment but legally unavoidable, was catastrophic. The foundation is now under massive legal review, its assets frozen, its scholarly publications being pulled from circulation. The true history is being prepared for publication, a seismic event that will rewrite the narrative of power and influence in the country. Elias Vance, the disgraced academic, stands in the calm light of his resolution, fully, morally vindicated. His papers are being prepared for immediate reinstatement, his theories no longer called paranoia, but pioneering historical foresight. The irony is profound. His latent skill, the obsessive ability to read the structural lies in a blueprint, had saved not just himself from ruin, but an essential historical truth from permanent burial. He takes a deep breath. His war is over, and he has won. He isn't rich. The evidence he uncovered wasn't gold, and the Foundation's assets are tied up in litigation. But the truth is more valuable than any inheritance. This is the new beginning. He is no longer lost. The final shot rests on him, looking determined, holding the original small safe, the mystery box bought with his last $50. It's no longer a burden of desperate chance. It is his legacy, the physical manifestation of his resurrection, the proof that the underdog, armed with nothing but the truth, can topple institutional power. He has earned his second chance to contribute, not as an outcast, but as the man who exposed the lie and salvaged the past. The dust has settled now, not just the concrete particulates Elias kicked up in the treasury, but the historical dust of a century-old lie. We began this journey with a man at his absolute limit, his destiny priced at a meager $50. That single reckless purchase, the rusty, unassuming safe, was the catalyst for a redemption he couldn't have imagined. It was the ultimate long shot. Look back at the gold coin, the one that bore the cruel osprey crest and lay inside the safe. Arthur Hayes called it the price of silence, the payment made by the Wakefield Foundation's founder to bury the truth and secure his institutional power. That coin, a symbol of systemic corruption, was meant to keep the secret locked away forever. But Elias Vance's only payment, his final desperate gambit, was his last $50. That $50 didn't buy him wealth. It bought him the key, the journal, and the map. The $50 was the cost of his redemption, the tiny moral stake that defeated the century of greed symbolized by the gold. What Elias saved was not a vault of treasure, but a legacy, the true historical record of an age of conscience that was nearly erased. The foundation is crumbling, their narrative exposed, and history itself is being corrected. Elias, the flawed underdog, the seeker exiled for his inconvenient truth, is now the architect of that correction. His victory proves that truth, even when buried under concrete and institutional power, will always find its way to the surface, often through the most unexpected and desperate hands. This story is more than a mystery. It's a blueprint for justice achieved against impossible odds. The question now isn't what was inside the safe, but what the truth demands of us next. This archive, salvaged by a single determined man, is just one chapter in the secret history of the world. So tell me, what other lost histories do you think have been deliberately sealed away by powerful forces? Let me know in the comments below, because next week we are diving deep into the strange, suppressed case of a vanishing fortune that bankrolled an industrial revolution, and I promise you, you won't want to miss it. Make sure you're subscribed.